Tonight, I am going to try to take you through about 70 years of history, some of which is looking forward into the future. So it'll be roughly from about 1969 or so to the 2030s. But let's start by acknowledging that something of the scale of the internet does not get done by one or two people. It's part of a flow of inventions that started, in this case, as early as 1962. I'm not going to walk through all these names because it would take too long, but I want you to appreciate two things. First of all, that it's not all Americans who were involved in the ultimate invention of packet switching and the internet. There were people in France, there were people in England, there were people in Norway, there were people in Italy and Germany, there were people in Japan, and other parts of the world as time went on. The lists that you see here are the ones who mostly were involved from about 1969, or 62 actually, until about 1974 or 75, which is when an awful lot of this technology was developed. So you should appreciate many hands in this pie, and not all of them in the United States. This was a predecessor to the internet. It was called the ARPANET, which stood for the Advanced Research Projects Agency Network. That organization was started in the Defense Department in 1958. Now, some of you will remember that in October of 1957, the Russians launched Sputnik. And the president at the time, Eisenhower, was pretty upset that the Russians made it into space before we did, but he was even more concerned that because they demonstrated that capability, that they might also be able to loft nuclear weapons in orbit and drop them anywhere they wanted to. So this caused the creation of the Advanced Research Projects Agency, whose first job was to get us into space. But the president also concluded that he didn't want this kind of technology, the space technology, to be developed by the Defense Department. He wanted it to be a civilian enterprise, and so he caused NASA to be founded, and ARPA handed that project off to NASA in the late 1950s. So NASA is doing the space thing, and ARPA now has to figure out, well, what else can we do? Well, in those days, computers were becoming important, not nearly as important and ubiquitous as they have become today, but they were still very important. And so they began working on information technology and the possibilities of using computers. They decided to start investing in, guess what, artificial intelligence in the early 1960s. They had about a dozen universities around the US that were doing research in AI. And every one of those departments said to ARPA every year, you have to buy us another world-class computer so we can continue to do world-class research. And even ARPA couldn't afford to buy a dozen computers every year of the latest variety. So they said, we're going to build a network and you're going to share your assets. Everybody hated that idea, but they said, we're building the network anyway. And oh, by the way, you know how networks used to work with the telephone system? It's called circuit switching. You dial another person, and the system builds as an electrical connection, literally, from the telephone handset to the receiving handset when they pick it up. And that link stays up for the length of the conversation until somebody hangs up. Worked great. Remember, it started in 1876, so by this time, it's a well-known, well-understood technology. There's just one little problem. When computers are exchanging information with each other, they exchange it very, very quickly, and they want to blast the information out to many different computers, one after the other. If you had to dial up, wait for the computer to pick up the phone, so to speak, send the data, hang up, redial, takes too long. So they decided to introduce a notion called packet switching. And for all practical purposes, everything you know about a postcard applies to internet packets. So let's rehearse now. First of all, a postcard has a to and a from address and some content. That's true of internet packets. They have a to address, from address, and content. If you put a postcard into the post office destined for some place, there's no guarantee that it comes out the other end. This is called best efforts communication. This is true of internet packets. They can get lost. Another possibility is if you put two postcards in destined for the same party, they don't necessarily come out in the same order you put them in. This is also true of the internet. Now, there is one thing the internet does that the post office doesn't. If you put an internet packet in, sometimes two of them come out because the system may think it lost one and it retransmits. And so the recipient now could either lose the data, get more than one copy, or have them come in out of order. And your natural reaction to this is, who the hell would want a system like that? And we said, well, the way you make it better is you put another layer of technology, another protocol on top. In this case, it was called Transmission Control Protocol, or TCP. Some of you will have heard the letters TCP/IP, which is Transmission Control Protocol and Internet Protocol. So the Transmission Control Protocol has a very simple idea. And to help you appreciate that, let's imagine that you have a book that you want to send to a friend, but the post office only carries postcards. So let's see what you would do. Well, first of all, you'd have to cut the pages out of the book to fit the postcards. And then you'd notice that not all the postcards have page numbers on them because you cut the pages up. And you know they could get out of order, so you number the postcards, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then you know that some of them might get lost, so you keep copies of the postcards just in case. And then you then start sending the postcards, and then you wonder, how do I know when I can throw away my duplicates? And you get this brilliant idea. We say, well, my friend can send me a postcard that says I got all of them up to number 420. And then you realize that postcard might get lost. So you wonder, what do I do then? And the answer is, well, you look at your watch or your calendar and you say, well, I haven't heard anything from my friends, so I'm going to start sending copies until I do get a postcard back saying I got everything up to 420. There's only one other small problem. Suppose you had a 1,000-page book and you cut it up into 2,000 postcards and you send it to your friend, and by a miracle, the post office delivers all 2,000 postcards at the same time into your friend's mailbox, which holds 200 postcards. And the other 1,800 land on the ground and the dog eats them or the wind blows them away. Okay, so you have a deal with your friend. I won't send more than 200 postcards until I get a postcard back from you saying you got all of those, and then I'll send the next batch. That's called flow control. Guess what? You know how the internet works. Now there's some other little details like domain names and mapping of IP addresses and routing through the system, but that's basically how it works. So I was a graduate student at UCLA in 1969, and I was responsible for writing software for the Sigma 7 computer. That computer's in a museum now, and some people think I should be there too, but I'm not, I'm here. And our job was to demonstrate this packet switching protocol could work. And we did. It did work. Incidentally, in 1971, we invented an application called electronic mail. I didn't do that. One of my colleagues, Ray Tomlinson, did that. And it became the most popular of the applications on the net. And even today, people still send email. Too much of it, I know. I get a lot of it. So this thing worked really well. But it was just one network, and it was kind of small. But we grew that network over time. We extended it into Europe. We extended it to Asia. And so over several years, this one network grew very, very successfully. However, after it worked, my colleague, Robert Kahn, said, you know, computers might be useful in command and control, because if you're trying to manage military resources, and if you use computers to do that, you might actually be able to overcome a larger opponent because you managed your resources better. The implication, of course, is that those computers would have to be available in mobile vehicles and ships at sea and in airplanes. This network, the one that's on the screen, tied the blue dots together with dedicated telephone lines. Well, this doesn't work. You know, the tanks run over the wires and they break, the airplanes never make it off the tarmac, and the ships get all tangled up. So my colleague, Bob Kahn, who by that time was at ARPA, had started work on a mobile packet radio network and a packet satellite network for long-distance communication. So he was looking at more than one packet switch net. He showed up in my lab at Stanford in the spring of '73, and he said, we have a problem. And I looked at him and I said, "What do you mean, we?" And he said, "Well, we're trying to figure out how to get these different networks to work together. They have different packet sizes, they have different addressing structures, they have different latencies, they have different data rates." So they were all packet switched, but they were incompatible. He said, "How do we make these networks compatible?" That's when we invented the TCP/IP protocols. This is what a packet switch looked like at UCLA in 1969. It was the size of a refrigerator, and it was delivered with very, very heavy metal enclosure. There's a good reason for that. The Bolt, Bear, and Newman company that delivered it knew that it was going into an extremely hostile environment, graduate school with a whole bunch of graduate students, and that's very hostile. You know, they all want to know how it all works. So that was a packet switch size of a refrigerator in 1969. Now you have more power than that has in your pocket, of course. But then we were doing the mobile radio stuff. And so this van was put together by SRI International in the Bay Area. And it had no markings on it of any kind. It had a stacked dipole array antenna at the top. And we were experimenting with mobile radio communication in the Bay Area. And the story is that this thing was driving up and down the Bayshore Freeway. And the engineers would pull off the side of the road. The driver was an engineer, so he would get out and go into the back to work with everybody else. One day, a police car notices this unmarked big van on the side of the freeway with a radio sticking up. And then he notices there's nobody in the cab. So he goes back and knocks on the back door. They open up the door. And there are these geeky-looking guys with beards and electronic equipment and radios and displays and computers. "Who are you?" And somebody says, "Oh, we work for the government." And he says, "Which government?" "But officer, we were only going 50 kilobits a second." Now, just to show you how ambitious we were, back then we knew that command and control meant more than sending text messages around. We knew that we had to include voice and video as well as data. So we started working with the packet radios. Those white things, they were a cubic foot. They cost $50,000 each. And we started working with essentially packet voice communications, where the voice stream is digitized, chopped up into these little electronic postcards, transmitted, reassembled at the other end, and then played back as sound. And you can see the fancy telephone equipment we used, the little Mickey Mouse phone there. But what was interesting about this experiment is that the backbone speeds were actually fairly modest compared to what we do today. A voice channel of digitized voice is usually about 64,000 bits per second. You sample the voice 8,000 times a second, and each sample is 8 bits, so 8 times 8,000 is 64,000. If you had a 50 kilobit channel, you can't even get one voice channel through this thing. So we had to develop ways of compressing the voice signal. And one of those ways was called linear predictive code with 10 parameters. It modeled the voice track as if it were a stack of cylinders. The cylinders were changing their diameter as the person is speaking, and the stack is excited by what we called a formant frequency, but you would call pitch. So the parameters of the cylinders plus the formant pitch was sent. Those 10 parameters were sent to the other side digitally. The other side took those in, did the inverse transform, and produced sound. Now, I'm sure you can appreciate that when you go from a 64,000 bit per second voice stream to an 1,800 bit per second voice stream, you might just lose a little of the quality of the sound. So as it happens, anybody who talked through our packet voice system sounded like a drunken Norwegian. They were understandable, but there was this quality difference. And so by this time, I'm at ARPA, I'm running the program, and I have to demonstrate the voice system to a bunch of generals over at the Pentagon. And I remember thinking, okay, how am I going to do this? Then I remembered that Ingvar Lund from the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment was one of the parties working on packet speech. So I said, okay, Ingvar, I want you to call the generals on the Autovan system. That's the standard circuit switch system for the Defense Department. And then I want you to talk through our packet voice system. And it sounded exactly the same. So we didn't tell the generals that everybody would sound that way if they went through the system. So I just wanted to show you a picture of Bob Kahn. He and I have received many awards. This is just one of many. But we've been friends and collaborators literally since about 1970, so a long time. Well, I mentioned TCP/IP. That was the core of the internet multi-network system. I've already mentioned we had a packet radio system. That's that funny little blob on the left. The ARPANET itself, the thing that looks like it's swallowing up the satellite network, is the ARPANET extended all the way into Europe. And then there was the packet satellite net, which was using Intelsat 4A over the Atlantic to move data from the western part of Europe to the eastern part of the US. So I wanted to demonstrate that the TCP/IP protocols would actually work in this multi-network environment. So we had the packet radio van going up and down the Bayshore Freeway, radiating packets into a gateway that connected to the ARPANET. It carried the traffic all the way to Europe through an internal satellite hop. And then it popped out of the ARPANET, went into a gateway into the packet satellite network, which carried the traffic all the way back over a geosynchronous satellite link to the US, into another gateway, back into the ARPANET, and then all the way across the country to Los Angeles. Now, those of you who know your geography know that San Francisco and Los Angeles are only about 400 miles apart. But the packets went 88,000 miles because they went twice to synchronous satellite height, which is 22,400 miles up and back. There's 44.8, twice. That's 88 plus. And it worked. And I remember leaping up and down in my office at Washington saying, it works, as if it couldn't possibly work. It's software. Everybody knows when any software works, it's a miracle. So this was a very important demo that the TCP/IP multi-network internet technology could really work over these different kinds of networks. Well, since that time, that was 1977, we concentrated on designing and building implementations of those protocols on every operating system we could find, and back then there were a lot of them. We got all of that working, and then we forced everyone who was on the defense networks to switch over to the TCP/IP protocols on January 1, 1983. So that was the operational birthday of the internet. After that, other research funding agencies in the US invested in building their own internet systems and then interconnected them together into a growing network. And so the National Science Foundation, the Department of Energy, and NASA all connected their laboratories together. NSF wanted to connect 3,000 universities to the 5 supercomputers that they were funding so that they would have access to significant computing power as they were performing their research. So those 4 networks became the backbone of the US internet for quite some time. It's still not commercial though. This was strictly for people that had contracts with the various research agencies. But during this period, up to about 1989, there was rapid growth, even though this was largely a research program. Now, in 1994, the 25th anniversary of the ARPANET occurred, and Newsweek magazine decided they wanted to sort of highlight this 25th anniversary of the basic technology. So my friend John Postel and Steve Crocker and I were asked to go put this shot together. It took us all day. We had to go get yellow squash and green, zucchinis. We had to get 5-pound tins of coffee and string the whole thing together. We wanted to demonstrate how primitive the technology was at the time that we were working on the ARPANET. And there was a small geek joke in here in case you didn't notice it. Can you see that there's no mouth to ear link? It's ear to ear and mouth to mouth. This network would never work. And this was something like August of 1998 when this photograph was taken. So that was our little geek joke for the people that got it. Now, what's also important for every one of you who's using the internet today is to understand that something else got invented and essentially released in December of 1990. These 2 guys, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, who was not Sir Tim at the time, and Bob Caillot, were at CERN, the Center for Nuclear Research in Geneva. And Tim had this idea that it would be really nice if his colleagues could send their physics papers to each other with the illustrations and everything else in a standardized way and make it easy for them to point to their various papers, refer to them. And you all know the term hyperlink. That was part of the idea that Tim Berners-Lee had. So he released or announced that this World Wide Web idea had been created in December of 1990. It consisted of 1 server and 1 browser all in the same machine. It was a Next computer. That was it. That's what he showed. And not too many people noticed. However, there were two people at the National Center for Supercomputer Applications that's run in Champaign-Urbana. They took one look at the text-based browser that Sir Tim had done, and they said, wouldn't it be cool if we had a graphical user interface? So they programmed this, and they called it Mosaic, and it was the first of the graphical interfaces, which all of you use today. Well, that got everyone's attention because the internet suddenly looked like a magazine with formatted text and imagery, and eventually, of course, streaming audio and video, as we all know. So Mark and Eric hit the ball out of the park with this Mosaic browser. There was a guy who had started Silicon Graphics, Jim Clark, who took one look at the Mosaic browser and said, this is a big deal. And he went to Champaign-Urbana, and he brought Mark Andreessen and Eric and others back to the West Coast to start a company called Netscape Communications. That was in 1994. In 1995, they went public. The stock went through the roof, and the dot boom was on. Anybody who was doing something that looked like it might be part of the internet was getting money from the venture capital people. And that went on until about 2000 when the dot bust happened. But the internet continued to grow. And of course, some companies that were started back then, like Amazon and Google, have survived very well through that period. In fact, there's confusion about the World Wide Web and the internet. So one day, Sir Tim and I got together. He wears a t-shirt saying, I didn't invent the internet. My t-shirt says, I didn't invent the web. But the web sits on top of the internet as an application, and the internet supports it. And it was Tim's idea and our idea that we should give away the design of those systems and the software that goes with it so that anybody who was interested could get access to it without any barriers at all. That was a very important decision on both our parts. Of course, today the internet looks like this. It's this gigantic tens of thousands of network system. And what's interesting about it is that each network is operated independently of the others. They have different business models. Some are for-profit, some are non-profit, some are run by the government. They decide on what software they're going to use, they decide on what hardware they're going to use, and they decide who they're going to connect to and on what terms and conditions. Sounds like chaos, doesn't it? The only reason it works is they're all using the same TCP/IP suite of protocols. They've all agreed to do that, and that's why it continues to work. And what's amazing is that some 80% of all those interconnect agreements are handshake deals. They're not even documented, business deals at all. They said, you carry our traffic and I'll carry your traffic. I'm sure that if I had tried to explain that to an economist back in 1973, they would have laughed me out of the room. This couldn't possibly work. You don't understand economics. Well, where are we now? Computers are everywhere. And I don't want to go through every single one of these things, but I want you to appreciate that what has happened is computing has become a handmaiden for so many different activities that the phrase computational X for almost any value of X you can think of, linguistics, physics, astrophysics, and so on, chemistry, biology, that computational X has a meaning today that it might not have had even a decade ago. So now, of course, we've also invested very heavily in machine learning and large language models and things of that kind, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. But you should appreciate that it's the computing power and the networking, which is spread across the globe, that really makes a huge difference. There are massive neural networks that have been developed. Some of you will remember a company called DeepMind, which is one of the Google sister companies, developed a program to play Go. And some years back now, it played Go with Lee Sedol, who was a Go expert, and beat him 4 games out of 5. No one was expecting anything like that to happen. So what was important is that this multi-layer neural networks turned out to be extremely powerful tools for learning statistics, learning stable statistics of complex systems. And more recently, the company has discovered a way of calculating how proteins fold up. And that's important because a protein only interacts with the rest of the body unless it's in the right shape. And so knowing what all the shapes are tells us something about how those proteins that are generated by DNA might actually function. And of course, cloud computing is everywhere. It's becoming very heterogeneous. There are different kinds of computers in the cloud now. There's the traditional central processing unit. There are graphical processing units. There's tensor processing units for specialized artificial intelligence. And someday there may be quantum processing units if we can ever get the quantum computers to work. They don't yet. So just another little bit about the internet. There are organizations that run day in and day out trying to make sure the internet works for you. These are organizations you probably never heard of, and they were never planned ahead of time. As the internet grew, those of us who were involved in this invented organizations to take care of some particular problem. So the Internet Architecture Board was responsible for the evolving architecture of the internet. The Internet Engineering Task Force is where the standards get made. The Internet Research Task Force is where we experiment with new ideas that aren't quite ready for standardization. There was an international cooperation board that allowed multiple agencies across different countries to cooperate with each other. The regional internet registries allocate IP addresses to the internet service providers. Internet service providers came along in commercial form in 1989. Internet exchange points connect the internet service providers together. The Internet Society got started to house the Internet Engineering Task Force. It just goes on and on. The thing that's terribly important about all this is that the World Wide Web has spread globally. The world uses the internet through the web. And the thing which is really telling is that the design of the internet was transnational. So some of you will remember in the telephone system, there were country codes that you could dial. 44 is England, for example. We decided early on, Bob and I, that we would not use country codes in the internet. Now, we do have country codes in the World Wide Web, so there's .fr for France and .us for the US, but at the lowest level of numerical addressing, it's all topological. And there was a reason that we did that. We were thinking at the time, okay, we're going to build this multi-network system. We're going to use it for command and control. If we had a country code-based addressing structure, and we're planning to invade country X in 2 weeks, can you imagine having to go to country X and saying, hi, we're planning to invade you in 2 weeks. Can we get some address space so that we can get our command and control system to work while we're in your country? Probably doesn't work. So we avoided that completely. And the consequence of that is that the internet doesn't know anything at the lowest level about country boundaries. And so packets flow from country to country without realizing that they've crossed a geopolitical boundary. That turns out to be something of a challenge now because all the people that use the World Wide Web are able to send data back and forth anywhere in the world. You can pick up a web page from anywhere and display it, unless, of course, somebody decides they don't want you to do that. And that, of course, is one of the battlegrounds of today. There are countries that would like more control over what traffic can cross international boundaries. And I can tell you that would destroy the internet if we started putting in barriers like that. Web pages would not come up because pieces of it wouldn't be accessible. Data exchange for commerce wouldn't work because the banks couldn't send data back and forth. So universality of the internet does conflict with notions of sovereignty. It also makes it more important for nations to cooperate with each other to deal with the fact that some people don't do good things on the net. They do harmful things. And when they harm other people, especially if they cross international boundaries, somehow we have to cooperate with each other to track down the people who are doing those harmful things and hold them accountable. And so there is a great deal of debate up at the UN level among countries about cybercrime treaties and other agreements to help hold parties accountable for their harmful behavior, while at the same time trying to preserve this global asset which allows free exchange of information. I've already talked a little bit about AI and the like, so let me just bring up a few things that might be relevant to you. I mentioned the folding of proteins. AlphaFold is a program that helps us do that. The DeepMind people generated a dictionary of 200 million proteins that could be produced by human DNA. So we have this big catalog, and if there is a disease process that involves proteins, you might be able to find a little molecule that could be produced with appropriate DNA to interfere with that disease process. Or you might actually be able to find proteins that will enhance health. And so that catalog is a very valuable asset, one which was generated by using artificial intelligence. The large language models are, of course, the thing everybody's talking about these days. They have been instrumental in doing speech recognition and speech synthesis. Those of you who talk to your mobiles or talk to your laptops to dictate, or in Sigrid's case, using something called live transcribe to take sound in and then produce captions on her mobile in real time. Those are things that the large language models have allowed us to do. Translation also, we translate 140 languages back and forth between each other with varying degrees of quality depending on the amount of teaching material that the large language model has been able to ingest. We can even take speech that might be impaired, maybe from cerebral palsy, recognize that speech and then generate better sounding, better understandable speech with a program called Euphonia, which means good sound. We also, like others, have been experimenting with what's called multimodal generative output, where it's not just text that comes out, but it's imagery and sound and video even. However, there are some deficiencies in the large language models. And the people who study these things have a formal term for one of the deficiencies. It's called hallucination. And so I want you to understand that Google and others are well aware that the large language models, even if they're trained with factual material, can produce counterfactual output. And I thought, okay, I'm going to test this. So I got one of the bots and I said, write Vint Cerf, an obituary for me. And I figured that was a reasonable thing to ask because it probably ingested the format of obituaries because the web has, people die every day and the web has lots of obituaries. So I assumed the large language model would respond to a request to write an obituary. And I figured there's a little information about me on the web, and so it probably could find that as well. So indeed, it wrote an obituary for me. Started out, we're sorry to report Dr. Cerf passed away. And then they gave a date, which was much too soon as far as I was concerned. But it went on to describe my career. And it gave me credit for stuff I didn't do, and it gave other people credit for the stuff I did. And then it got to the family members part, and as far as I know, it made up family members that I don't have. And so I'm scratching my head thinking, how the hell does that happen? And I realize, now remember, I'm not necessarily the expert in artificial intelligence, but my little cartoon model of this says that what's missing from the training process, which is mostly what's the likelihood that this word would follow this set of words, the training process lacks what we'll call context. So imagine, for the sake of argument, that Ambassador Schoenfeld's bio and my bio show up on the same web page, and the system is just plucking words from the bio saying what's the likelihood that these words would follow each other. And when it's in generative mode, it doesn't know that the word it just picked was from his bio, and the next word it picked was from my bio. So it doesn't have that context, so it can easily mix things up. Now, like I say, that's a little cartoon model of what could possibly go wrong. But I've come to believe that we need to help people understand what's going on so they can appreciate the risk factors. So I think I'm going to shoot a little video. I'm going to pretend to be Sigmund Freud. So, I kind of look a little bit like him. Well, what we have now is the artificial ego and the artificial id. And what we are missing yet is the artificial superego to control the uncontrollable impulses of the artificial id. And sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, right? So we have work to do. But I can tell you that these things have been very powerful. They've allowed us to do things that we couldn't possibly have done before. Some of them are quite surprising. I remember asking one of the chatbots to write me a haiku in the Elizabethan style, which it did. So, and I couldn't have done that. So I'm very impressed with that. Well, I've actually covered all of this in my remarks. So, whoops. Like I said, we have a lot of work to do to deal with some of these deficiencies. We also have a lot of work to do to make internet more available and accessible to people all around the world. We only have about 6 billion people who have direct access to the internet, and the other 2 billion are still waiting for either physical access or training to use it or affordable and sustainable access There are a lot of parameters that have to be met in order to make internet sustainably available. And so that's part of my work at Google as its chief internet evangelist. I want to switch gears now to tell you about a project that got started in 1998. You will remember perhaps that in 1976, 2 Viking landers successfully landed on Mars. This is a pretty big accomplishment. And then for the next 20 years, nothing worked. You know, we missed the planet, or we burned up in the atmosphere, or we crashed on the surface. And then in 1997, the Pathfinder mission from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory successfully landed once again on Mars. Now, do you remember it was kind of a little rover that looked like about the size of a Lego truck? And the way it was landed was in a bouncing balloon. And I remember thinking, God, if I'd been the program manager and my engineers had come in and said, "Hi, we're going to deliver your $6 million rover in a bouncing balloon," I would have thrown them out of the office. It actually worked, you know, boing, 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 and then it deflated and the little rover rolled out. I was so excited about that project's success that I jumped on a plane and flew to the Jet Propulsion Lab to talk to the people who were handling communications for that project. Remember, they're sending data all the way from Mars, which is anywhere from 35 million miles to 235 million miles away, depending on where we are in our orbits. So I got all excited about that. The Sojourner was the name of the project. The Sojourner was the name of the little robot, and the Pathfinder was the name of the project. Of course, subsequently, there have been other landers. But what happened in 97 is that, or 98, we're finishing each other's sentences in the first 10 minutes of our chat. And then we asked ourselves, what should we be doing in 1998 that's going to be needed 25 years from now? Which, by the way, would have been 2023. And we decided the thing we needed to do was to design and build a solar system internet, something that would span the solar system to support manned and robotic space exploration. So that's what we started doing in 1998. In 2004, we had prototypes that were working terrestrially, and the 2 rovers, Spirit and Opportunity, landed on Mars in January. And the plan was that the data from the rovers, Spirit and Opportunity, would be transmitted directly from the surface of Mars back to what was called the Deep Space Network. These are big 70-meter dishes, that's 210 feet, in Canberra, Australia, Madrid, Spain, and Goldstone, California. That's a honking big antenna. And the radios on the rovers started to overheat. So the engineers said, okay, back off on the duty cycle. We don't want to ruin the instruments or the radios. And the scientists at this point are getting really grumpy because the data rate that they were going to get at all was 28 kilobits a second from the surface of Mars. But one of the engineers at JPL said, oh, we have 2 X-band radios on the rovers. Okay, so he said, yeah, but we sent orbiters 2 years before to map the surface of Mars, and they're still there. They still have radio and power and computing and memory and processing capability. And we said, well, we have some prototype software that could hold the data in the rover until the orbiter gets overhead and then send the data up to the orbiter, and then the orbiter would hold on to the data till it gets to the right place in its orbit to transmit data back to the Deep Space Network. And we said, do you want to try our prototype stuff? And they said yes, much to our surprise. So we uploaded the prototype software. Every rover since that time has been using this store and forward relay. That's packet switching, by the way, in order to get data back. And oh, by the way, because the orbiters are not very far away from the surface of Mars, you could transmit the data at 128 kilobits a second. And because the orbiters are outside of the atmosphere with a bigger antenna and more solar power, they can transmit data back to the Deep Space Net at 128 kilobits a second. So the scientists have been getting four times more data, four times more data than they were getting before using store and forward packet switching. So we were pretty happy about that. And then we started loading this stuff on the International Space Station. We've been running there for quite a while. We've been doing experiments with the European Space Agency, with the Japanese Space Agency, with the Korean Space Agency. We're planning to be on board in the Artemis return to the moon missions that are coming. We've already done one flyby around the moon. We'll have another 2 years from now with people on board. They won't land, but the next mission after that, they will. NASA has already started inviting the private sector to engage in helping design and build habitats and laboratories and rovers and other communication systems. So they've already triggered interest in this in the commercial sector. So our software, which is now standardized and it's available, all of it, software is available for free, as is all the documentation, could be used to build step-by-step this solar system internet. Now you might ask, as we did in 1998, internet works on the Earth, so it ought to work on Mars, right? Can't we just use TCP/IP? And we said, yeah, that ought to work. And then we started to do the math. Because the Mars and Earth have varying distances because of their respective orbits, it takes 3.5 minutes for a radio signal to go to Mars when we're closest together, 20 minutes one way when we're farthest apart. The round trip time is 40 minutes. The TCP/IP protocols were not designed with a 40-minute round trip time delay. The flow control in the system is really simple. When you're starting to run out of room, you send a packet to the other guy saying, I'm running out of room. And he's supposed to stop sending until you tell him, I got some more room now. And that doesn't work if it takes 20 minutes for the other guy to hear you say, I'm running out of room. Meanwhile, he's pumping data at you at full blast and it's falling on the floor. So we said, okay, that's not gonna work. And then there was one other little problem. The planets are rotating and we don't know how to stop that. So if you're talking to something on the surface of the planet and it's rotating, after a while you can't talk to it until it comes back around again. Same problem with the orbiters. So now we have a variably delayed and disrupted environment, much more difficult than the internet world, which is low latency and heavily connected. Lots and lots of optical fiber and radio links and now low Earth orbiting satellites and everything else. So we had to design a whole new suite of protocols that we call the bundle protocol suite. So that's what we're using for the Interplanetary Backbone Network. The cool thing about this is that when we launch spacecraft to do scientific missions, after they finish that mission, we can repurpose them to become nodes in the Interplanetary Backbone Network. So over the decades, it'll grow mission by mission. And I won't see the end of that, but younger people will. And it's kind of cool to be part of the beginning of something like this. I feel like I'm in chapter 2 of a 35-chapter science fiction story. I won't see the end of it, but it's been a heck of a fun thing to be at the beginning. So that's my message for tonight. I really appreciate your attention, and I'm ready to turn to Q&A if you have any. So thank you for that. Oh, Lord, when the ambassador asks questions, now I get nervous. Okay.
I've known Vint and Sigrid with Susan now for 25 years, and I've seen all the hats that Vint has worn. And so my question is not about the science, which I have no idea what he's talking about, but my question really is, how would you advise young people who are just starting out what to look for, how to start their careers, what are the pitfalls, etc.?
Okay, so lesson number 1. Nobody can plan their career. Don't try. If you meet any successful people, and I suspect there are a bunch of you in this room, and you ask, could you have planned your career? The answer after they stop laughing is no. But what they had in common, what you probably have had in common, is people recognizing opportunity when it shows up. And sometimes it shows up in some pretty weird ways. For example, your company went bust, or an experiment that you were planning failed miserably. Yeah, my company went bust. I used to work at WorldCom until it went belly up, and I ended up going to work for Google as a consequence of that, which, by the way, had a really interesting little anecdote to it. I sent a note to Eric Schmidt, who was the CEO. Dear Eric, you want some help? I sent a note back saying, yes, that was my job interview. And then I'm talking to Larry and Eric and Sergey, and they say, what title do you want? And I thought about it, and I said, Archduke. Then they went away, and then they came back and they said, you know, the previous Archduke was Ferdinand, and he was assassinated in 1914, and it started World War I. Maybe that's a bad title. why don't you be our chief internet evangelist? And I said, okay, I can do that. Now, that's one lesson. Second lesson is that if you want to do something really big, get help, especially from people who are smarter than you are. And that's been, for me, rule number one, get help, because you can't do big things without a lot of help. Another thing that, lesson number two about careers is that if you're going to do something, you might as well do something that you're good at. Why do you want to work on something that you're not good at? So being good at it's really important criterion. Then there's a third important criterion, which is you should be able to make a living at it. And that helps a lot if you're going to have a successful career. So I advise kids to try to meet those criteria and to be observant about opportunity when it shows up, even if it shows up in a wolf in sheep's clothing. Next question. There's one.
We got one right here.
Okay, go for it.
How does China control access to the internet? We were there, 10 years ago and couldn't get on Google or Gmail or the weather.
Well, you must have been staying in the wrong hotel, because the Chinese don't block internet in the hotels that foreigners tend to stay at because they don't feel the need to do that. The reason that they want to filter is for their citizens not to have access to information that they don't want them to have. And so they've instituted a huge surveillance system. They get into the guts of the internet. They handle the flow of the traffic in and out of the country. It's so-called Chinese firewall. They've gotten very sophisticated at this. In the social media, for example, instead of just trying to block things, they have people that they pay to reinforce the government's view of things. And so in the social media, you'll find somebody says something that is antithetical to the Chinese government. They'll have 50 people that they pay 50 cents each to go submit something that essentially countermands the assertion that was made. So not to be simple-minded about it, they've done a very, very good job of monitoring and managing the internet. The part that's important, though, is that all they can do is manage their own system. They aren't interfering with everybody else, with one exception. There are Chinese hackers who are out there who do bad things, either to get intellectual property or to do ransomware, which the Russians do too. Among others, the Koreans, North Koreans are also making money out of hacking. So we engineers have a really, really big challenge ahead of us, which is to countermand a lot of those bad behaviors. But we can't stop the Chinese from doing what they want to do with their piece of the internet.
He's wondering why TCP/IP version 4 is still so prevalent, and we haven't really morphed into V6 too well.
So this is a kind of a geeky question for everybody, but let me explain why it's significant. When Bob Kahn and I did the original design, we didn't know how big this thing was going to get. And so we asked ourselves a simple question. Remember, it's an experiment. We don't even know if this is going to work. But we know that it's going to have to be international in scope. And in those days, 1973, 1974, we didn't think there would be very many national networks. So we thought, well, maybe there'll be 2 per country, so there'll be some competition. And then we said, how many countries are there? And there was no Google to ask that question, so we guessed 128 because that's a power of 2, and that's how programmers think. We weren't too far off. It was probably 180 at the time. So we said, okay, 2 times 128 is 256. That's 8 bits, 2 to the 8th. And so that's all we need for network ID. And then we'll need, how many computers per network? And we said, well, what the hell? How about 16 million computers per network? And remember, computers of the day were millions of dollars, time-shared machines. So we figured that'll last forever. Nobody would buy that many machines. So we had a 32-bit address space. Now, since that time, the address space structure has been interpreted and reinterpreted and reinterpreted to accommodate a larger number of things on the net. But around 1992, the engineers are saying, okay, you blew that one. We really, really, really need a lot more address space because there are going to be a lot more devices, billions of them, and a lot more networks. And we said, okay, you're right. So the Internet Engineering Task Force spends 4 years arguing back and forth to develop a 128-bit address space protocol called IP, Internet Protocol version 6. Now, the reason that it hasn't taken over by storm is that at the moment that we are proposing to do that, thinking, you know, the system isn't very big, everybody could just do it, right? So, and here's the design. You know, it's real simple. It's very straightforward. Well, it's 1996. Do you remember what happened in 1995? Netscape Communications went public and the stock went through the roof and the dot boom was on? Nobody had run out of IPv4 address space at that point, and they were too damn busy trying to figure out how to get money to start their internet companies, so nobody paid any attention to IPv6. Clever tactics to reuse the IPv4 address space came along. I won't bore you with the details. So people have been able to survive with the original design, but we're getting to the point now where that ain't gonna work anymore, and there's an increasing trend towards IPv6. And in fact, I would say about 30% of the networks are carrying both v4 and v6, but about 66% of the traffic is being carried with the v6 protocols because a lot of that traffic is streaming audio and video from the social networks and from some of the YouTube and other things like that. So the answer has been a damn slog, and I just keep hoping that I'll be alive to celebrate when the last v4 address goes away, or at least everybody can do v6. So you can tell your friend I'm still waiting. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, thank you. If I understand correctly, the World Wide Web is basically people are on it, countries are on it with consent. It's like a partnership around the world. Do you see any danger in some of the autocratic countries you've described, China, how they handle it? Do you see any danger in the breakup of the World Wide Web?
So the internet, as I mentioned earlier, was designed to be global in scope and to be insensitive to country boundaries. The World Wide Web, on the other hand, has country boundary indicators because the URLs, the Uniform Resource Locators, end in .us, .fr, and .com and .net and so on. The problem that we are running into now is not just with the authoritarian countries. It's our own country here in the US, in the EU, and elsewhere. Why is that? What people have discovered, and what we have discovered, is that when we drop the barrier to nearly zero for people to generate and to exchange and to obtain information, we drop the barrier for everyone, including the people that did not have your best interests at heart. And so that barrier in the World Wide Web and in the internet in general is zero. So people have the ability to generate huge amounts of information, some of which is untrue, some of which is deliberately misinformation or disinformation. And now with generative AI, you can generate even more of that stuff. So countries are rightfully worried about trying to find a way to remove or at least reduce the amount of bad information that's flowing around in the net and to maintain the flow of information, of useful information across the internet. I think this is going to be a long slog, and I think that we can't solve this problem by purely technical means. We can do a few things. We could ask people to authenticate themselves strongly in the net if they want to express themselves and be credible. So information that comes from an unknown source with no provenance might get less attention or at least less credibility than one in which the source of the information is documented and known. And we have technologies like digital signatures that let us do things like that. But the real filter is wetware up here. It's called critical thinking. And I want kids and adults to learn how to do that. It takes work. This is not something that's free. You have to think. The price you pay for the freedom of information on the internet is using your brains, using your thinking to ask questions like, where did this stuff come from? Is there any corroborating evidence for the assertions that are being made? What was the motivation for this being put up on the net? We need to ask those questions and get answers to them for ourselves and for others. But that's going to take some serious rethinking of norms in our societies. And I sincerely hope that we succeed at that, because the last thing I would want is to see the internet to become a cesspool of information which is broken up into little fragments and becomes less and less useful over time. So that's a tough problem. Thank you for asking. I am, along with many others, trying hard, including with the United Nations. I chair something called the Leadership Panel of the Internet Governance Forum, which has been meeting for 20 years on governance of the internet. And we've been trying to find various policies that would deal in part with that problem. Okay, next question, way in the back. I don't know where.
We have a question from our online audience. back
Wow,
here.
I didn't know we had online too. Okay.
We do.
The question was very similar to the one that was just asked, but would amplify that to ask, who are the culprits likely to be that we have to defend against, and who is going to provide the defense?
Yeah, well, part of the answer is you and I have to do some of that. Part of the answer is that we may be the sources of misinformation. Have you ever gotten an email from someone that has sort of a spectacular headline on it, sounds really scary, like the post office is going to charge you 2 cents for every email or something like that, and you send it to all your friends saying, oh my God, it's a disaster, without even thinking about it? So there are sites on the net, like one's called Snopes, S-N-O-P-E-S, that try to essentially debunk a lot of this kind of misinformation. But the people that have to fix that are not just the carriers of information. I mean, our company offers YouTube and of course many websites, and others have platforms for distributing this data. We have a role to play there, but the recipients, that's you and me, also have a role to play as well. Countries are beginning to try to pass laws that make it prosecutable to produce misinformation and disinformation. But I have to tell you, this is a very, very tricky topic. Let me give you an example. If you're a scientist, one of the things that you learn as a scientist is that your theory needs to be tested. The term they use is falsifiable. What that means is an experiment that would prove the theory wrong. And you need to be prepared. In fact, you need to want to do those experiments in order to test whether your theory holds up under serious experimental evidence, or with the experimental evidence. So what can happen is that someone could go, let me pick on Alvin for a second. Alvin, you go to a specialist, it's me, and you say, I have a problem. And you say, you ask me, what can I do about it? And I say, well, Alvin, based on my knowledge, you should do X for some value of X. 10 years later, Alvin's still got this problem, and he shows up and he says, well, I'm still having the problem. X didn't work. And I say, well, okay, I've had 10 more years to study this, and so you should do Y, which is different from X. Now, Alvin can have one of two reactions to this. The one I like is the one that says, thank you very much for this new information. I'll go off and try Y instead of X. But he could have a different one. He could say, so you lied to me when you told me about X, so I'm not going to believe Y either. Science is not absolute truth. It's the best model we have of the way things work at the moment, and we have to be ready to reset. And there are a lot of people who say, that's flip-flopping, that you've misled people deliberately. Well, we didn't. We just gave you the best answer we had at the time. So we need very, very much to hang on to this understanding that not everything, even if we thought it was true, is necessarily true. We have to be ready to accept a different truth that shows up after experimentation and research. Okay, I see one back here.
Countries change and things change all the time, and I guess you know that. And so you said you sit on the UN Council for Internet Governance, and I'm wondering, what countries are doing? Are there any great pieces of legislation internationally regarding net neutrality, regarding citizens' access to whatever they want to see? And what are those pieces of legislation? How do we make them happen here if it's not here?
This is one of those questions like the physics final exam. Describe the universe in 25 words or less. Give 3 examples. It's a good question. First of all, there are countries, the European Union has been extremely active in passing various legislation, the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, the Global Digital Privacy Protection Regulations. There are a whole series of things that the EU has tried to do, some of which are somewhat contradictory. I mean, protecting privacy while at the same time trying to hold parties accountable, meaning you have to identify them, causes some conflict. So there's effort going on, and certainly in the Internet Governance Forum, that topic has been back and forth for 20 years now. In the UN, the Secretary General started a program which is meeting in September, the Summit of the Future. Coming out of that program is something called the Global Digital Compact, which is a framework for international agreement on a variety of desirable outcomes, one of which is free flow of information, accessible internet, sustainable internet, but also some mechanisms whereby countries can support each other to identify parties that are behaving badly and harmfully, and to identify them and hold them to account. This is a non-trivial exercise, but it is the only way I think that we're going to get to a point where we can start to use legal means to hold parties accountable. And I think that's very important.
Right here.
Yes.
I want to thank you and your company for developing AlphaFold, because I think it's going to revolutionize medicine and biology in the future. And I'm just wondering, have you monetized it, and how are you thinking of having other entities use the product?
Well, now this is an area where I don't have as much knowledge as you would like, so I'm not sure that I can give you a correct answer. I understood that, that our intent was to make that fairly openly available. The DeepMind team is very, very much imbued with a desire to share what they've learned and how they have learned it. So I think the answer is that's supposed to be widely available to spur research and to help others figure out in this giant catalog which possible proteins might be helpful. The flip side of that is that when you're looking at disease processes, this is me, the engineer, pretending to know anything about biology and physiology, but often there are signaling chains, intra and intercellular signaling chains that lead to particular disease processes. And if you can find out what those chains are and which proteins are used in order to do the signaling and interfere with that, you think about COVID and the SARS-CoV-2 virus, it's got this little spike, and the spike matches up with something called the ACE2 receptor, which is throughout your body, it does a variety of different things. But if you could stick a little bump on that little prong and interfere with its ability to dock with the ACE2 receptor, you could inhibit the effect of SARS-CoV-2. So these are the sorts of things we're hoping for. And I hope others will contribute what they have learned about the proteins that are important in the body so that we can look at that catalog and figure out whether we can do something useful with that information. But thanks so much for that question and for your comment.
Thank you so much for the presentation. This has been fascinating. Can you speak to what you're most either excited about to see sort of breakthroughs that have recently happened, or the biggest challenges that you sort of see coming? I mean, there's so much innovation that I feel like has been produced out of this, but what are you most excited about right now for the near term? Well,
of course, I'm quite excited about the interplanetary stuff. I have another project with another group called the Interspecies Internet. Peter Gabriel and I and two other people who've been very interested in the cognitive capacity of non-human species have been working since 2013 to try to help the researchers collect signaling information coming from non-human species. The reason it's interspecies internet is because we're imagining someday that we might allow two non-human species to communicate with each other using the internet to juxtapose them if they weren't co-located. So, the whales are out in the water and the chimpanzees are in the middle of the forest, and the internet could connect the two of them. Originally, thinking about this in purely simple-minded terms, we thought, well, we would just send the signals back and forth between these two non-human species. But then we realized that if we could learn more about intraspecies signaling, intraspecies communication, I hesitate to use the word language here because that's a very loaded phrase, but intraspecies communication is something we're beginning to learn about. There's a company that was called Fluent Pet that made this little hexagonal array of buttons that the dogs could push. And what happens when they push the button is that it makes a sound. And the sound is recorded by the pet's owner. And so words that your pets know, like, walk or leash or food or ice cream or popcorn or whatever else, they can push the button in order to exercise their desires, express their desires. And since it's just recording sound, it works in any language. So on the net, there have been a variety of YouTube videos showing a very smart little dog that has about 20, 30, 40, 50 of these buttons to push. And some of them put together sequences of buttons to convey their intent. So that project is starting to grow. We met with a bunch of researchers in this area at the Santa Fe Institute just a few months ago. Now we're starting to set up collections of the communications that these various species are generating. And we're trying to figure out what was going on at the time. So we want to associate the context with whatever signaling was happening. The reason the internet starts to get even more interesting in all this is that if we in fact begin to understand the semantics of the communications, we might be able to translate from one way of signaling to another. We're far away from that, but we do it for human languages now using the large language models. So the other thing that I found quite interesting is that some species know about each other's warning signals. So prairie dogs and birds share knowledge of each other's warnings, and based on what we've seen so far, the warning signal is actually pretty rich in semantics. It can say whether or not the predator is an airborne predator or a ground-based predator. It appears that they say something about the size of the predator. We even think maybe color. So we're very excited about that possibility over time, that we would begin to understand better the cognitive capacity of non-human species. So that's another thing I'm all excited about. I guess the other thing that I continue to be excited about generally is our ability to use computing power to enhance our own human capabilities. I speak English. I understand British some of the time, not all the time. I have a little German and a little bit of Russian, a little bit of French. But our large language models seem to speak these languages extremely well, and they translate them pretty well if you've ever gone to Google Translate. It's not always perfect, but it's amazing what it can do. So I'm excited about putting computer power to work to enhance our own capabilities where that's possible. So the future looks to me like it's going to be really, I just wish I was 8 years old so I could see what happens in 2100. I haven't figured out how to do that. Okay.
Over here.
Yes, sir.
With the satellite advancements in the internet, do you see individual companies controlling space areas, or do you see interconnections working out between companies? So you have SpaceX, you have AST, you have all these different companies that are spending, billions of dollars to try to get satellites up. Is it going to be one satellite, or each company having their own proprietary system, or does there have to be some communication worked out? Well,
interestingly enough, a lot of the proposed low Earth orbiting satellite systems are compatible with the internet, so they interconnect on the ground, generally. I do think that because it's such a capital-intensive effort, there won't be very many different companies launching this sort of thing. On the other hand, in the interplanetary internet, where we don't have nearly the proliferation of equipment, there's a smaller number of devices, our going-in assumption is that in the early days of commercialization of space, that we will have government and commercial networks sharing resources and interacting directly with each other. So the bundle protocol suite that we've been designing for interplanetary communication is intended to allow multiple parties to share their communication assets in space. It's especially important in emergency situations where you want help from anybody who is locally available. So we're pretty excited about the idea of a mixed commercial and government interplanetary system in the early stages of development. Over time, we may see the same thing that happened in the internet, where you have a proliferation of internet service providers. There is an economy of scale that shows up, which is why you see SpaceX and Starlink have grown very big very quickly. And that will probably be similar in the space case, that there will be some smaller number of large companies and possibly a larger number of smaller ones.
Right here.
Hi, Vint. That was actually a very similar, more articulate version of my question. I was going to ask more about, you know, what we're looking at in that cool-looking diagram and why. I think I'm seeing Mars, the Moon, and Earth. And the gentleman behind me, you know, like I said, very well put. The companies that are involved, and obviously the interplanetary internet is costly and way out in the future. But can you just at least explain what you put on that diagram and why, and what we do have so far?
That diagram, that's not literally how all the connections happen.
Okay.
Yeah, that diagram, though, puts stuff up that we already know is to be launched or is already in operation. So what you're seeing is the zoo, the interplanetary zoo, over a period into the 2030s when we get to Mars. The actual equipment, some of it will be replicated. There will be multiple satellites that are in orbit around the Earth, for example, or around the Moon to assure communications. So, the way I'm looking at this right now is that there are two kinds of investments that are underway. One of them is driven by the scientific desire to know what's out there. What can we discover about the world, the way the world works? But there are other people who have been ignited by NASA to offer to NASA rovers, habitats, laboratories, and other equipment on the Moon. Here's an interesting problem. NASA has offered to buy the output of a mine on the Moon. So the natural question for a private sector company is, that sounds great, we'll go build a mine. By the way, can we own the territory that it's on? And the Outer Space Treaty of 1967 says no. And so the question is, well, how will the private sector react to the idea that it can mine the territory, but it doesn't own the territory it's mining? It owns the equipment, and it can sell the product. So I don't quite know how long that's going to last, or whether there will be the notion of private property on the Moon. I mean, all you have to do is wander around Vail to appreciate what private property means here. So I'm not sure how that's all going to work out. But the reason it's important is that it's not 10 years from now or 20 years from now. It's 2 years from now. It's 3 years from now. It's upon us because of the commercialization that's starting to happen already. And I find that really exciting, because now we're in, you should pardon the expression, terra incognita.
How vulnerable is the net itself, not the information, to be broken by bad people, to be controlled, taken over by people they shouldn't?
Let me make sure I understand the question. Are you saying how vulnerable is the network?
How easy is for somebody to take over the net, break it, control it?
Yes, okay. So the answer is there are vulnerabilities in the system. I'd be the last guy to say otherwise. Those of you who were following the recent, CrowdStrike situation, that was really an amazing, most of these things are cascade failures. Oh, and by the way, the worst ones that happen to us are usually not an attack by anybody. It's a dumbass mistake by some engineer. And I mean, I've done a few of my own too. Fortunately, the network has not totally collapsed in all the years of its operation since 1983. But a lot of these things require more attention to precision and testing before you release code. This particular CrowdStrike involved a piece of code that was automatically distributed to thousands of machines. And once they ingested it and installed it, you've heard the famous blue screen of death. They failed, and then they rebooted, and they failed again, and they rebooted, and they failed again. The only way to fix it was to go to the machine physically, power it off, and repower it in order to get it to work again. And so this was really hard for a lot of people that had tens of thousands of machines that were running this particular software. So my reaction right now is that we need to work a lot harder from the operations point of view to make sure we test stuff before we release it, and we release it in small quantities. At Google, we are very careful about canary releases. Like we'll release a piece of software to a very small number of people and look to see whether it goes fut. And if it does, we say, okay, that didn't work, and we back out. So that's the other important thing. If you're going to release a new piece of software, you better figure out how to get back away from it after releasing it. And that's, you always have to have a back out strategy. The internet has not totally failed in its operation, but parts of it can be shut down. Countries can turn the internet off by turning the underlying transmission facilities off, or by cutting an optical fiber cable. We have this happen a lot. It's usually not deliberate. It's a ship that dropped anchor and got dragged, and the anchor split that's a technical term, split the cable. And man, that's expensive to go find the two ends and pull it up and glue them back together again. So a lot of us are working at Google and elsewhere on richer fiber environments. If you've ever looked at Telegeography, it's a company that makes these maps of all the cables. Most of them go east-west under the water, and almost nothing goes north-south. So imagine for a minute the possibility of laying north-south cable and switching systems on the bottom of the ocean, on the floor, with the cables connected. So if a cable gets cut, you can route around it. Now this is a non-trivial exercise, and we're talking about, like 50 kilovolts of, going to a thing that's underwater in the salty water. It's not a trivial thing to do, but we think that might be a way of building resilience into the system. For the bad hackers and everything else, we keep a catalog of all the bad software that we've learned about that people report to us. It's called Virus Total, which sounds kind of horrible. But we keep this list that other people can refer to about the various viruses that have been discovered and are floating around in our internet universe. There's just a lot of work to be done to make things more resilient and more resistant to deliberate failure or accidental failure. That's a never-ending task. But I can tell you that there are literally hundreds of thousands of people who every single day have as a job to keep the network running. It doesn't run all by itself. It runs because there are people who are dedicated to making it work for you and for me.
Ben, that's a good note to pull your closing thoughts from. We've reached our time, and you've now heard from our community what's interesting to them and what they're concerned about. I wonder if you can offer us something to take away as folks head home tonight.
Well, I hope you take away from tonight that I'm still very enthusiastic and excited about the internet and what it can do, the possibilities that are still as yet uncovered. But I want you to take away one particular grumpy thought. I meet kids that are 6 years old, 8 years old, teaching their colleagues how to make web pages and how to play computer games. And I'm sitting there thinking, this sucks. This kid's 6 years old, he gets to use the internet. I didn't get to use it till I was 28, and we had to invent it first. I'm really glad to know that so many people are finding this a useful environment. In spite of all the problems that we've alluded to tonight and talked about, I would still argue that the internet has brought capability to us as a population, not just here in the US, capabilities that we could not have imagined. Well, we did imagine some of it 50 years ago, but not at this scale and not with this capacity. There's still a long ways to go. There's plenty more to invent. I hope some of you will come up with some new ways to use this amazing technology.
Ladies and gentlemen, Vint Cerf.
Thank you.